Hello, friends. We've come to the last week of our course um, in the Black Social Gospel. Uh, this week we are bridging between the chapters on the Civil Rights Movement of 1955 to 1968, and then the last chapter will deal with that period that takes us just into the early 1970s and the founding of Black liberation theology. Um, so these are very detailed renderings, and it's clear why it needs to be as thick and detailed, as complex as it is once you get the movement story, because this is the greatest story we have in this country, was the Civil Rights Movement, and all the demonstrating and the issues and the figures and all of it that made it so great simply need to be given their due. But there are sort of two things that I go in some detail in here that don't have to do with that have to do with early Dr. King and then also his graduate um, program, his graduate training. And here, these two things are related. There are deficits on both sides that I'm seeking to address. On the former, yes, I do go pretty long on his early background, his family, his church, the enormous importance of being raised in a church family where his father's a minister and his mother has a huge sort of impact on his psyche and development, and his grandmother too. And one reason I think it is so important to bring all of this up is that so much of the King literature out there has almost nothing about it. And that's because so much of the King literature just takes King's own tack when he described his life and career in Stride Toward Freedom. He gives you this very seminary-oriented account of his background that just doesn't give anywhere near the credit to his family and church background that it deserves, that you just need to have in order to understand him at all. And then we have a kind of flip side of that with regard to the graduate education stuff, because that is what King emphasized when he told this story. But then later, when we started to get a better generation of scholarship about King in the late 1980s, some of the people who were pioneers of that work, they compensated by overcompensating. And now they're telling you that his graduate education actually didn't matter to him, and he didn't take it seriously, and he just bombed around Boston in his car. And so, of course, he plagiarized these papers and then his dissertation, and just pay it no mind. Because it doesn't really matter. We're just, we'll get into a hurry here to get to Montgomery and King there. And I think this is just almost equally wrong. It denigrates King's intellectual seriousness. It doesn't allow you just to understand why theology was so important to him, why he is a personal idealist. That personal idealism has given him a philosophical and theological language for talking about the infinite value of human personality, and that he preached out of then for the rest of his life. I mean, King's sermons are just resonant with the language of personal idealism. Not too surprising when you consider that the whole barrel was written in his first year at Montgomery. The rest of his life, he's out in the movement. So that barrel of sermons that he morphed out of, riffed on for the rest of his career, the whole thing was there by the end of his first Montgomery year, which of course is the year that he wrote his dissertation. So I did go kind of long on all of that. And of course, the other reason why historians, were happy to take this out, to not even talk about his theology and his graduate education and all that, is that you do get a lot of historians in this field who just can't track philosophical arguments anyway, and can't explain what post-Kantian idealism is or how it could be some kind of a theology. So the plagiarism story did give them something of an out, especially that they're able to say, well, I'm virtuous in doing so because I'm emphasizing King's earlier background. I just think both of them have to be there. You just don't really have King without it, and you don't have the person who personally welded together the mostly secular New York-based NAACP civil rights movement in the North with the Southern church-based younger civil rights movement in the South. These are two different movements, and they've got precious anything in common, but what they have is Martin Luther King, who early on developed a kind of genius for being able to speak to multiple audiences in ways that were theological, and that changed the world. So we're going to, we move into a discussion of James Cone and the founding of liberation theology in the chapter for next week. There is, this is where I came in, and it does show, I think, probably in the narrative. I was in high school in the 1960s. Dr. King broke through to me like nobody else. I read all of his books in high school. He was the formative figure for me in just what it means to take Christianity seriously and what it means to be some kind of a public intellectual and a social justice figure, movement leader. So what ideas I've got about religion and politics are just mostly focused, on Dr. King. I did have this, the Jesus, that figure on a cross in Catholic churches, that figure did get through to me. And then we lost Dr. King too. He was cut down while I was in high school. And then these two cross stories just melded together in my thought and feeling. So when I went to college, my question was, what's the way forward of that? What is the civil rights movement going to be now in my time, in the 1970s? And that is how it came to be that the first theologian I ever read was James Cone. I mean, that isn't quite literally true because, of course, I'd read all of King's books, and King was a theologian. I think it's very important to say King was a theologian. But the first theologian I ever read, the first theologian who teaches theology for a living was Dr. Cone. And I'm not reading him because I'm interested in what's happening in theology. I don't know anything about theology. What I'm interested in is where is this civil rights movement story going? And he had a lot to say about that. So I read his books as soon as they came out. I talked to our college president about them because I found myself sitting next to him at one of those meet the administrators meetings. I was terrified to talk to a college president, but I thought, well, he happens to be a Presbyterian minister and he taught in a seminary, so maybe he would be interested. And he surprised me by saying, well, perhaps we should invite this Dr. Cone to campus. So he got there a few months later. He gave this talk that the first part of it was a précis of his first two books. Then he went to a second section in which he said some very hard things about white liberals and Black church leaders and Martin Luther King. He lightened the mood for a moment with a song by the Rascals that everybody knew, All the World Over, So Easy to See, People Everywhere Just Want to Be Free. And then he held up a copy of Alma College's course catalog, and he ripped it to shreds from a standpoint that nobody had ever heard at Alma College. We were being taught white theology, he said, and white philosophy, and white sociology, and white psychology, and white history, and white everything else, as though only white thought ever counted as true thought, and all of it was being sold to us as a liberal arts education. I thought, for the rest of my college time, and really since then, that what I was doing is mostly just catching up with everything I didn't understand in those books, and all that was in um, that electrifying talk. And some of that will register in this last chapter of this book, in the founding of liberation theology, and some of his back and forth with J.D. Otis Roberts and so on. The book ends with Pauli Murray. It wasn't going to be that way early on. I had her in every chapter, always showing what she was doing that was, related to what's going on in that chapter. But then I ended up deciding that that she was being lost, that even that was sort of marginalizing her. So I ended up pulling it all out and putting it at the end of the book, making her whole life a commentary on the story just told. And of course, for Murray, for most of her life, it's a story about just asking, well, what is it that's excluding me this time, or the next time, or that time? She's brilliant. She's creative. She's trying to get a job that's commensurate with her abilities, her degrees, her willingness to do hard work, and she keeps being excluded. Well, is it because I'm Black? Is it because I'm light colored? Because I'm female? Because I'm gay? Because I'm queer? She doesn't have a language for being queer, but she has a queer experience and is struggling to find language for it. And that's her question for most of her life. It's just, what's even the hierarchy of factors that is excluding me, that are excluding me? And this turns into a happy story because in the 1970s, she did finally get the kind of teaching job that she had craved for her whole career. And then is writing a memoir, about 600 pages, and discovers in the course of writing this book that she realizes the book just isn't very good because there's something missing from it. She is missing. She realizes that she has been on a spiritual journey her whole life without knowing it. And without talking about that, and without even seeing it in the rest of her life, this book just doesn't come together. And moreover, really, she needs to go to seminary to work on this, belatedly or not. And so, if indeed the meaning of her life is the spiritual journey that she has been on all along, she has to go to a seminary in her mid-60s and become an Episcopal priest. So you see her often referred to as a womanist. I think this is not quite right. Womanism is a generation later, and there are many things that Pauli Murray was that are definitely in womanism, that are requisite in womanism. But she did not have the racial consciousness that I think is a prerequisite. Pauli Murray was an old style liberal integrationist with regard to race. She feels that her personal dignity has been violated anytime someone is making any kind of an issue of her race or anybody's. So that's what she didn't like, of course, in Cone or even in J.D. Otis Roberts. And I think it is what disqualifies her from being counted as a womanist, but proto-womanist for sure, and a great one. Well, friends, I've cut quite a few of these videos and they've all been too long, so I'm going to just cut this one short right now, hoping it's short enough to be able to send it to you. So take care. I look forward to our Moodle discussion next week. Be well.